As you know, there's a lot of controversy in the nutrition space. A lot of people are promoting a low-carb, animal-based diet for improved body composition and better control over appetite. And the mainstream institutions are promoting a low-fat, plant-based diet. And it turns out that there was a recently published study in 2021 randomizing people to either have a low-carb, animal-based keto diet versus a low-fat, plant-based diet. And it turns out that this 4-week-long study where individuals were randomized to have a keto diet and then switch to a plant-based diet, or have a plant-based diet and then switch to the ketogenic diet in a metabolic ward, it turns out that this analysis has been reanalyzed, and there is in fact a diet carryover effect favoring a low-carb, animal-based ketogenic style diet when it comes to improvements in body composition, weight loss, and appetite control. Okay, so the study that has been reanalyzed here that was published in 2021 is titled Effect of a Plant-Based Low-Fat Diet versus an Animal-Based Ketogenic Diet on Ad-lib Energy Intake. So here's the graphical methods of the study. As you can see here, individuals either went on a low-carb, animal-based keto diet for 14 days in a lab, and then were immediately switched to a low-fat, plant-based diet. So there was 10 people in that group who did basically keto first, then plant-based second. The 20 subjects were randomized, okay? The other subjects went on a low-fat, plant-based diet for 14 days, then switched to a low-carb keto diet. And we'll talk about what they found, but it's important to understand that this was recently reanalyzed. And essentially what the investigators found when reanalyzing the data is there was a carryover effect, meaning that there should have been a washout period. And I know this is hard when you're doing a metabolic ward feeding study, but there should have been probably a 2-week washout period to ensure that there wasn't any carryover effect, because what happens when you cut out the carbs in your diet and you start eating more protein and fat, you start to see a reduction in plasma glucose and insulin and increase in ketones. It turns out that that carried over and favored the plant-based diet group more so than the low-carb group. And so it depends on the order in which you do this, and there was no washout period, which is what the investigators that reanalyzed the study that is titled Physiologic Adaptation to Macronutrient Changes Distorts Findings from Short Dietary Trials, Reanalysis of a Metabolic Ward Study. This was published by David Ludwig, Nicholas Norwitz, who has been publishing a lot of great content. I will link descriptions to his channel in the description below. He recently, as you may recall, published a case study of an individual who had been on a low-carb diet for over 6 years and then had a 14-day period where he was having, I think, 12 Oreo cookies per day and saw a massive shift. I think it was like a 200-point swing in his LDL cholesterol. We reviewed that study. But really interesting here, and I want to just start with sharing figure 2 from this reanalysis of the metabolic ward study. As you can see here, the changes in fat mass favor the low-carb ketogenic style diet first. And you can see here in part A of figure 2, when individuals did the low-carb, animal-based keto diet first, they had greater fat mass changes compared to when they did the low-carb ketogenic style diet second and did the plant-based first. And so that's what we're looking at here. There should have been a washout period in this study. And the investigators write, when the low-carb diet was consumed in the first treatment period, the physiological carryover effect in absence of a washout period greatly lowered energy intake in the subsequent low-fat, plant-based diet intervention. Conversely, when the low-fat plant-based diet was consumed in the first period, the carryover effect greatly increased energy intake on the subsequent low-carb, animal-based ketogenic diet. And so there's another paper here. In fact, Kevin Hall, who, as you may recall, was the primary investigator on the original study, he published this as a preprint. It's titled Diet Order Affects Energy Balance in Randomized Crossover Feeding Studies That Vary in Macronutrients but Not Ultra-Processing. They say in the results here, subjects randomized to a low carb and then switched to, in the feeding study, a low fat style diet lost 2.9 kilograms more body weight and 1.5 kilograms more body fat than the low fat, low carb group, likely because the low carb to low fat group consumed 922 calories less than the low fat to low carb group, reducing energy intake in the low carb to low fat versus the low fat to low carb was driven by the last 2 weeks, perhaps due to carryover effects of gut adaptations over the first 2 weeks arising from large differences in mass of food, fiber intake, and more. So we're going to take a deeper dive into this analysis and look at the changes in blood glucose, insulin, fat mass, appetite, and much more. But first, friends, I just want to say thank you for being here. I know this gets a little complicated. The images that we're about to share will really help convey the story and help you better understand and have better arguments when people share the original metabolic reward feeding study that was published in 2021. So if you're enjoying the content, please hit that like button, leave a comment in the comment section below, and share this with a friend. Also, because we're talking about appetite, I do want to let you know about the Berberine Fasting Accelerator by Myoscience. This is a wonderful tool that can help you particularly with your evening food cravings. If you're new to berberine, the thing you need to understand is this has a large dossier of safety and use. It's been used for over 3,000 years in traditional Chinese medicine. Every year, investigators publish over 700 articles on berberine alone in the context of metabolic health. So over at myoscience.com, there's been over 320 reviews. People like Helen are saying this definitely helps with fasting and cravings for things that I shouldn't be eating. That was published on the 4th of April. Mark C. just wrote, less craving. I've been on the product for 10 days and I'm really satisfied with the way it gets rid of my desire to eat at night after my last meal. So you can check out some of the many reviews over at myoscience.com. I will put links in the description below for the Berberine Fasting Accelerator, where you can save using the code podcast at checkout. So let's go on and talk about the metabolic reward feeding study and specifically look at changes in blood glucose, insulin, triglycerides, LDL cholesterol, and body composition. I think this is really important because when it comes to dietary regimes now, people really fall in basically one of two different camps: a low carb style diet, and that includes all of its different variations from keto to paleo to carnivore. And then you have folks that are following a low fat plant-based style diet. And you need to understand what happens physiologically and then make custom tailor the different dietary approaches based upon your blood work and your health goals. So in the initial feeding study, which was a metabolic reward study that lasted for 28 days, it was 4 weeks long. Remember, the subjects were randomized to either eat an animal-based low-carb keto diet for 2 weeks and then eat a low-fat, plant-based diet, or do the opposite, have plant-based first, then keto first. And it turns out reanalysis shows a diet carryover favoring a low-carb animal-based keto diet when it comes to reducing overall energy intake and improvements in fat mass. So as you can see here from figure 2 of the original study, there were between group differences when it comes to body composition changes, particularly body weight, favoring the low carb style diet. But as you can see, also when it comes to fat-free mass as well as fat mass, there were changes favoring the plant-based diet arm of the intervention. However, the reanalysis of this original data suggests that there was a diet carryover favoring the low carb style diet if individuals ate that way first because of reduced energy intake over the duration of the 28 study, finding that if people ate a low carb style diet first, they overall ate less calories over the duration of the plant-based study, which plant-based intervention arm of the study, suggesting that they got into a greater calorie deficit, which caused greater fat mass loss changes and possibly changes in appetite and more. But there were statistical differences between the different feeding studies feeding interventions, I should say, when it comes to blood glucose, triglycerides, LDL cholesterol, and insulin. And I think that's really important. So we're looking at table 2 here. So what are the significant differences here first that we see? And that is with regards to insulin, C-peptide, as well as triglycerides. We're going to go down here and look at triglycerides specifically. So at baseline, the plasma triglycerides were 75 milligrams per deciliter. Now on the low carb style diet, they actually dropped to 63 milligrams per deciliter. In contrast, on the low fat plant-based diet, they increased to 93 milligrams per deciliter, which I think is important because many medical professionals focus just on LDL cholesterol, but we also need to look at what happens to triglycerides. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Some notes here directly from the study. Both fasting and postprandial, meaning post-meal triglycerides, are thought to increase risk for cardiovascular disease. The low-carb diet resulted in decreased fasting triglycerides compared to baseline, whereas the low-fat diet increased fasting triglycerides. Notably, despite lower fasting triglycerides during the low-carb diet period, postprandial triglycerides were higher following the low-carb test meal. And so it is good to do non-fasted blood work periodically. and test your fasted triglycerides and then do your non-fasted triglycerides to see your post-meal rise in blood triglycerides. I want to pause here and just offer an anecdotal tip for you. I think it's good to do your fasting blood work once a year, unless you're dealing with an acute health condition or changing your diet or doing these different things to lose body weight or improve blood sugar health. You want to get a baseline establishment of where your LDL cholesterol is, your HDL cholesterol, your glucose, your insulin, and triglycerides. And then after you have that baseline, the next time you do your labs, have a non-fasted laboratory test, meaning you go to the lab after having a relatively high-fat meal. And I did this first in 2017 when I was doing a lot of bulletproof style coffees, and I had some eggs, 3 or 4 eggs, which I usually do with the yolk and so on, maybe some bacon, had a bulletproof style coffee. And I wanted to see what this high-fat meal was doing to my post-meal or postprandial triglycerides. And I was actually pretty disappointed that having that liquid fat in the bulletproof coffee, I used to be very liberal with my butter and so forth in those coffees, really, it almost tripled my blood triglycerides. So the take home for me here is having liquid fat is probably not good for taming down that post-meal rise in triglycerides. So this is known as the lipid load test. We've talked about this before. Basically, it entails having around 80 grams of fat, maybe 30 to 40 grams of protein, and a low carb, really low in carbs, and testing your triglycerides as well as other lipids, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, VLDL cholesterol, etc., in the post-meal. And you really don't want to get your blood triglycerides over 200 milligrams per deciliter. Ideally, that would be around 160 in the post-meal window, because a hypertriglyceridemia in the post-meal window is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. It is worth noting that in this study, they did find higher levels of LDL cholesterol and apolipoprotein B, as well as higher HDL cholesterol in the low-carb ketogenic style group compared to the plant-based group. But again, I think we need to look at this in context and evaluate individuals' risks and so forth. If we're seeing changes in glucose and reductions concomitantly with triglycerides, do we really need to be concerned about the increase in LDL and a decrease in VLDL? That was what's interesting here. The VLDL content increased in the plant-based group in comparison to the low-carb group. But we know that HDL increased more significantly in the folks eating the low-carb animal-based keto diet. But let's focus a little bit more on what happened to glucose. I think this is important because, as you can see here, if you're trying to prevent diabetes, which I will add this study right here titled, "Should Carbohydrate Modified Diets Be the First Option for Weight Loss in People with Impaired Glucose Metabolism? A Scoping Review." There's more and more reviews and studies looking at the effect that a low-carb animal-based diet has on blood sugar and diabetes prevention. And you can see here with using continuous glucose monitors throughout this different study, as well as changes post-meal, that a low-carb animal-based keto diet has a more significant reduction in post-meal insulin as well as post-meal glucose. And throughout the duration of the study, in terms of blood glucose variability, it definitely favored the animal-based low-carb style diet, not the plant-based diet. And because metabolic health is really top of mind, or should be top of mind for many of you and for most of Americans, because it's like 93.8% of Americans have some degree of poor metabolic health. It's only 6-point-something% of us that are optimally metabolically healthy. Steering everyone towards a plant-based diet is probably not the best thing for metabolic health. And you can see from these images here that just 2 weeks on a plant-based diet doesn't favorably improve blood glucose. In fact, it increases it, as we have seen. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, who really cares if the glycemic variability or the variability in glucose was much higher on the plant-based diet compared to the low-carb animal-based ketogenic style diet? Well, the investigators say that this is a potential concern because high glucose variability is thought to be a risk factor for coronary artery disease. Interestingly, they also note that postprandial lactate concentrations were much higher following a low-fat plant-based meal compared to the low-carb meal, likely due to increased glucose uptake and glycolysis after the low-fat meal. It's important to acknowledge that lactate, as we've talked about before in the context of cancer, is not always a good thing, especially in the context of stimulating some glucose-sensitive cancers, and we talked about the Warburg effect in other videos, the metabolic phenotypes with regards to colon cancer, pancreatic cancer, lung cancer, brain cancer, and breast cancer are impacted by both glycemic levels as well as lactate. So because cancer is on the rise, I wanted to share that aspect of that. But let's get back to other metabolites that could be increased when looking at different dietary approaches, such as ketones, and how that might affect fat oxidation and respiratory quotient. Well, it turns out that beta-hydroxybutyrate, as many of you know, is a ketone body that increases when you reduce the carbohydrate content in your diet. That was significantly increased on, as you might guess, the low-carb animal-based ketogenic style diet in comparison to the plant-based diet. And that was associated independently with a reduction in respiratory quotient, which is a way to approximate fat oxidation. So the investigators write, participants who consumed the low-carb diet first compared to the low-fat diet first experienced significant increases in the beta-hydroxybutyrate blood concentration on the low-carb style diet. In addition, they say, the low-carb diet first compared with the second participants had significantly lower levels of respiratory quotient, which, as I mentioned, is a way to approximate fatty acid oxidation, indicating greater fat oxidation on the low-fat diet, but it was probably due to the diet carryover effect. So that's it for fat oxidation, but what about mean energy intake, and how do the different diets and the order in which those diets are presented impact energy intake? Here's what's really interesting. In a repeated measures model using between participant comparisons, mean energy intake on the low-carb diet was much lower when this diet came first compared with the second. Remember, the clinical trial in this metabolic ward study either randomized people to have a plant-based diet first, then a ketogenic diet, or a ketogenic a low-carb keto diet, then a plant-based diet. So when the low-carb diet came first, overall energy intake was lower compared with when they did the low-carb diet second. I think that's important. And we depicted those in the figures that I'll explain a little bit more here. Conversely, mean energy intake on the low-fat diet was much higher when this diet came first. So I think this is really fascinating. And so we're looking at figure 1 here. And this is the reanalysis that was published in the Journal of Nutrition just several days ago. You can see the energy intake when the animal-based keto diet, low-carb keto diet, was applied first versus the low-fat diet first. You see definitely a significant decrease in energy intake because there was no washout period. And so I think this is important to acknowledge. And a lot of people have given folks in the low carb diet community flack for talking about this metabolic adaptation or becoming fat adapted. But it turns out that when you dramatically reduce the carbohydrate content in your diet, in your body, there are demonstrable shifts in energy partitioning, increases in LDL cholesterol, increases in HDL cholesterol, and reductions in glucose and insulin. And so we do see these metabolic adaptations, and it turns out that may affect overall energy intake. So this reanalysis even further confirms the calorie model of obesity and doesn't really necessarily discredit that in any way. It goes to show that the people that adhere to a low-carb keto diet actually ate less calories overall and therefore experienced greater reductions in body weight and fat mass over the dietary period, particularly when they did the low-carb style diet first and then did the plant-based diet second. I think that's important to acknowledge. So there's a lot of controversy here about what diet is best. And I think this is where becoming more individualized about this and experimenting with things and trying this different diet on to see if it works for you or what have you. But now, last but not least, diet order impacted fat mass changes over the course of the study. The investigators say, similarly, body fat decreased with consumption of a low-carb style diet first and increased with consumption of a low-carb diet second, meaning there was a diet order effect, and having a low-carb style diet first led to more favorable changes in fat mass over the course of the study. Again, adding more credence or evidence to the fact that calories, in fact, do matter. And you can see here the changes in fat mass were a 0.3 kilogram loss compared with 0.57 kilogram loss if individuals consumed a plant-based diet first versus a ketogenic style diet first. They're going to lose about half a kilo more over the course of 2 weeks' time, which I think is interesting. So in conclusion, it turns out that there is a diet carryover effect, and our body does adapt to our dietary changes. When we start to drastically reduce the amount of carbohydrate content that we have in our diet, there's a reduction in glucose, an increase in glucagon, a reduction reduction in insulin, changes in LDL and HDL cholesterol, as well as VLDL cholesterol. And it turns out that these adaptations last and persist. And then when we dramatically increase the carbohydrate content on our diet, then we, might have unfavorable effects, particularly if we've been fat adapted. And I think it's important to understand and just think about this on a practical level. When people go on vacation, for example, it's spring break now for a lot of folks. When you go on vacation, people sometimes gain a lot of weight. And why do they gain weight? It's not because they're having too many avocados or too many whole eggs or grass-fed meat. They're usually having high carb-based foods and overeating energy and calories. And so many of us who have been eating a low carb, style diet for a long period of time, we have more control and better regulation of our appetite because we're not consuming these hyperpalatable processed foods that are enriched in energy as well as carbohydrates in industrial seed oils and beyond. And so we inherently know this. And so I think that's something to consider. But on a bigger level, we also know that there's problems with metabolic ward studies as well as nutritional epidemiology. The problem with metabolic ward feeding studies is they're very short in duration. And so it's hard enough to have individuals do a 4-week, crossover study, but having a washout period would even make that longer, 6 weeks. I mean, it's one thing to contribute 28 days of your year to a feeding study, but 6 weeks is an even more demanding aspect of it. So we have limitations with short-term feeding studies, and we also similarly have limitations with observational studies. We have confounding effects. We have issues with controlling all the different variables and causation, trying to figure out, well, is it the diet? Are they really, folks, Stanford University or Harvard will randomize people, educate them on how to eat, and then follow up several weeks later. We talked about that feeding study in Stanford, the twins study. We have dietary recall issues. We have compliance issues. We have a lot of challenges when it comes to looking at nutrition, right? People are just confused by this, by what is coming out from the research. So I'm not suggesting that we all listen to N of one anecdotes, but we have now enough inertia, enough N of one anecdotes and people changing their lives by just cutting out the processed junk from their diets and noticing shifts in lab work, changes in their body composition, fat mass, belly fat, and beyond. So while I do think it's important for a lot of you to tinker and test with different diets to see what works for you, we have pretty good evidence to suggest that when it comes to losing body fat and getting better control over appetite and consuming less energy, the data really does actually, as you can see here, favors more of a low carb style approach. And it turns out that there was this diet carryover effect. And when people had a low carb style diet first before having a plant-based style diet, they lost more body fat. They had better improvements in blood sugar and insulin, as well as they ate less energy. And so I think that's worth considering. Now, whether or not that fits with your ethics or your morals or, perspectives on climate change, that's totally different. But if we're just looking at body composition, anthropometric changes, and metabolic health, good evidence to suggest that a low-carb ketogenic style diet is the way to go. Maybe not for everyone, maybe not forever, but what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments section below. Thanks for watching all the way through. I appreciate your likes, your comments, your shares. We'll catch you in a future episode down the road.